Welcome back to the Dataspectra tutorial video. Here I will walk through how to create the input files for Dataspectra. There are two types of input files for Dataspectra. First is the actual data. The data for this tutorial is downloaded from the BrainSpan resource. For more information about that resource, please see the first video. You can download the entire BrainSpan file from their website, but for today's purpose, let's use a version of the data that I've cleaned up. You can download these files from the Dataspectra website or just type in www.dataspectra.org/tutorial.zip. So first, we will open up our web browser and download the tutorial file from the mentioned link. By double-clicking on the file that was downloaded, we will extract it. You will see in the extracted folder that there are multiple files, including one called ds.tutorial.data.csv. Let's open this file just to take a look at it. This is the main data file, and along the rows we have different genes, and along the columns we have different samples. The main search term should be in one column. Remember, in this tutorial we want the user to be able to search for a particular gene, and so we want to make sure that the genes are in the first column. Just to note, I subsetted the data file from the original, so now it only has 500 genes instead of 50,000. This is just to make the file size smaller for this tutorial. Also, there's a second file called ds.tutorial.metadata.csv with information about each of the samples. For this file, the columns match up to the columns in the main data file, so each column has metadata information for a particular sample. For example, in this row, you can see the ages of the individuals from whom the samples were obtained, and it ranges from 8 post-conception weeks to 40 years old. For Dataspectra, we want all of the input files to be located in its own input folder. So let's first create that folder. For the purpose of this tutorial, make sure to create your input folder in your desktop. Let's call it dataspectra_input. We can then move our expression files in there. I should note that you don't need a metadata file to make a Dataspectra website. It can be used for some functions, but we don't actually need it for this tutorial. I'm just putting it in our input folder just for reference. So that's it for preparing the data files. All we had to do for that step was download the files and move them into a new folder. Next, we will create our parameter file. The parameter file is just a text file or Excel file that tells Dataspectra how we want our website to look. Because there are a lot of parameters, I've included a template in the tutorial folder that will help with this process. This file is called ds.tutorial.parameters.template. I've also included a completed version, ds.tutorial.parameters. You can use that instead of typing everything out with me. For this tutorial, we'll use the template file. Since all of our input should be in one folder, let's move it to our input folder and let's rename it. Let's call it dataspectra.tutorial.parameters. I'll put the finished website next to our parameter file so that it's easier for me to show you what the parameters refer to. Just to orient you to the parameter file, it's just a simple Excel file separated by sections. Each section starts with the term parameter and what I call the parameter type, such as site, sidebar, dataset. The parameter type is just a way to organize each of the components of the website. I'll talk about the components as we fill in the information. Also, one more note, in the first column we have parameter terms. These terms are used by Dataspectra to identify the various pieces of information that you will be putting in. So don't change the spelling of the parameter terms. I'm going to fill in this template in a different order because it'll make a little more sense for teaching purposes. First, we will fill in the dataset parameter section. This describes how our data is formatted. Just for reference, I will open up the data file again. Next to dataset key, we will give a name to our dataset. You can have multiple datasets, so we just need to give a unique name to identify it in other sections of this parameter file. We'll call it BrainSpan data here. Next, we need to tell it the file name of the dataset. Remember, the main data file was saved as ds.tutorial.data.csv, so that's what we'll put here. Search call stands for search columns. Since we want the user to be able to search for a particular gene, and the genes are in the first column, we will put a 1 there. Search row start tells Dataspectra which row our search terms start in our data. This is in case you have header lines in your data file. Our search starts in the second row. Next, we will create a panel parameter file. A panel refers to the section that holds the figures. There can be multiple figures and text in each panel. Each panel also has a tabbed section that describes the panel. Like the datasets, you can have multiple panels. I'll show you how to do that in a minute. We'll give our first panel a unique name. Let's call it Age Panel. Then we'll put in the info in the tabbed section. The set name refers to the bolded text, and info is the text below it. I'll paste some text in the parameter file for this. Next, we can give the panel a citation and also a link for the citation. For these parts, I'm just going to copy and paste some generic information. You can see that there is also a download data section. This will automatically fill in with the datasets that this panel accesses. Next, we will tell the panel how we want our figures to be laid out. For this first panel, we will create a title section and just one figure. You can see both of the sections here on the right. We specifically want the search term ARX to be above the bar plot. To do this, we will first put a start term. The terms that we have been using so far are unordered parameter terms, so the order doesn't matter. But sometimes we want the order to matter, so that's when we use the start term. The order of all the parameter terms for that section below the start term will matter. Each subsection of the panel, including plots and text, will be called figures. First, we will put in a figure that is simply the search term that the user requests. In the next column, we will put the figure key, which is the unique name for the figure. We'll call it age title. And then we will give it a width. The width of these figures are in percentage of the panel window. This is to allow for responsiveness as the user changes the width of their window. So since we want this title figure to take up the entire width of the panel, we will give it 100%. Next, we will put in the height, which we will put 200 pixels. Lastly, for the next two boxes, we will put in the row number and column number for the figure. The figure title will be in the first row and is the first and only column of that row. Next, we will also put in a bar plot. We will give this another unique name. Let's call it age bar plot. The width will be 100% and the height will be 400 pixels. This bar plot is in the second row and also the only column of that row. Next, let's fill in the parameters for the figures. First, we will fill in the info for the search term figure, the section here at the top of the panel, which we referred to in the above as age title. We'll make sure to use the same identifier, age title here, so that Dataspectra knows that we're describing the same element. The figure type will be title, and this figure will be accessing the BrainSpan dataset that we already described above. Now, this is a good time to talk about how the figures interact with the dataset. When the user searches for a term, the matching row from the specified dataset will be gathered. The figure will know which columns in the data to use because you will specify it in the section. So to implement this, we will first put in the start term. After that, put in text. Since we want just the search term and no other text there, the next column will be none. Then, the text we want displayed is the search term, which is the first column of our dataset. So we will put in a 1 in the third column. If you wanted another column, you can put instead that specific column number. And to mark that we are referring to the first column in our data file, we will put data there. For regular purposes, you will almost always put data in the fourth column. And lastly, we will fill it in with the color that we want. The color is specified in RGB format, with the numbers surrounded by parentheses and separated by semicolons. Here we want black, so we put 0, 0, 0. Now for the bar plot. The bar plot is another figure, so we will just copy and paste the parameter terms again and make sure that this section is separated by parameter figure. Let's make sure to use the same figure key as used in the panel, which will be age bar plot. The figure type will be bar plot, and it also accesses the BrainSpan data. We will now add a few custom parameter terms for the bar plot. First, we'll add value label. This term refers to the y-axis label. We'll use expression here. Next, add xtick font size. This is the size of the font on the X label. We'll set it at 18. And then we will put in the start term. Now we can create the bars in our bar plot. We will put in 3 lines that start with bar and label them as children, teenagers, and adults. I've taken a look at the metadata file and determined that the samples from children, which I define as greater than 0 days old and less than 13 years old, are in columns 239 to 382. The teenagers are in columns 383 to 432, and the adults are in columns 433 to 525. Note that the column ranges are inclusive. Also, there are other ways to specify the columns instead of using ranges. There is more detail in the documentation. We want the bar plot to plot the data from the data file, so we will put data again there. And finally, we want them to be colored differently, so we will put in different RGB values for the columns. You can see that there is another panel on this website. This panel uses the same data as a bar plot, but instead of just plotting the mean and deviation, it will plot the actual distribution of the points. On the left is a violin plot, and the right is a box plot. To create this panel, let's copy and paste the previous panel parameters, but this time I'll call it distribution panel. Here the information is largely the same. We will keep in and reuse the search term figure that we created above. Below the search term, we will put in a violin plot figure, which we will identify as age violin, and this time this figure will take 50% of the width. The height stays the same, and the figure is in the second row and first column for that row. The box plot, which we will call age box plot, will also take 50% of the width and is also in the second row and is in the second column in that row. To create these new figure parameter sections, we'll start with a copy of the bar plot figure section. For the violin plot, we will change the figure key to age violin and the figure type to violin. Also, we want to change the angle of the tick labels to 45 degrees, so we will put that in with the xtick angle parameter. We will then repeat this for the box plot, but change the figure key to age box plot and the figure type to box plot. And that's it for the panels and the figures. Note that there are many other figure types available beyond the 4 discussed here, and more are being actively created. You can take a look at the reference file for more information for how to create these figures. Now to wrap up our parameter file, at the very top of our template, you will see that there is a site parameter section. This section gives the basic information about the page. Site name appears in the large text at the top. I'll call it BrainSpan. Top name is a subheader. This can be your name or your group's name. I'll put in Dataspectra. The top name is also a link, so we will link it to the Dataspectra website. We will also put in a default search term. We will use the gene called ARX. There are a couple themes to choose from, including a light and dark theme. We will choose the light theme for this project. And since there are multiple figure panels, we will need to choose the default panel. Let's use the age panel. Next, we will fill in the sidebar. These buttons on the sidebar link to a specific panel so that users can switch between panels quickly. Here, you will put in the word start. Then we will put in a search box with the word search as the placeholder. We'll add a space. And for the buttons, we will put the age panel first. The button will have the word age in it, and it will link to the age panel by putting in the age panel key. Then we will put the distribution panel, which is linked to the distribution panel with the distribution panel key. So that is it for the creation of the parameter file. This step takes the longest, but it's still much faster than coding things up yourself. In the next video, we will talk about how to sign up for Google Cloud Platform so that it can host your website. Thanks for listening.